In this chapter, we will address the last component of the infancy developmental stage. As you may remember from Erik Erikson and the psychosocial personality development, he argues that children during the infancy and toddlerhood go through a process of learning to trust others through their interactions with parents. A healthy resolution, a healthy outcome would depend significantly on the quality of caregiving provided by parents. Those who were catered to and cared for are more likely to be on the trusting side, and those who may have been neglected would be mistrusting of the world. In toddlerhood, and toward the end of infancy, they begin to focus on autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is basically where individuals have a little bit more freedom to go around and explore, hence the word autonomy. And if parents allow for the child to have enough independence and autonomy, then the child would feel autonomous and empowered by that trust. If instead the parents shame the child for taking the initiative on different things and they scare him of exploring other parts, then the child would be resolving on the negative component of that. At birth, our emotions are not necessarily polished, and while we may be able to express a few things, we do not show the wide range of emotions that we are capable of experiencing and of demonstrating. The emotional development, however, is seen during as the child progresses, and as we look at the definition of emotions here, we find that these are generally feelings that have both physiological and cognitive elements. Now, as we get older, there will be a social component of our emotions as well. For example, if you tell a 7-year-old, aren't you embarrassed that people are seeing you crying because they didn't buy you a lollipop, that individual would have a social element to their emotion. However, if you tell that to a 1-year-old, they do not necessarily have that element in place, so we are going to limit ourselves to physiological and cognitive elements. Now, emotions are also believed to be the elements that energize development and that energize also our social circles and our social lives. Now, these are very difficult to determine because, for the most part, children may not be able to describe what an emotion is or what emotion they're feeling. In fact, sometimes even adults don't know what emotions they are feeling in relationships. When I work in therapy, a lot of individuals would sometimes get there and asking if they get some guidance with their romantic relationships, and I would ask them if they love their partner of 3 years. Their answer was oftentimes, I don't know. And so we could see how difficult emotions can be, and even more so for someone at 1 or 2 years of age. So the most reliable cues that we have for children when it comes down to understanding emotions are their facial expressions. But we also take into account their vocalizations and body movements, as they also are revealing of what the child is experiencing. What we see in our emotions worldwide is that happiness, anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and surprise are considered to be universal and basic, regardless of what language you may have been raised in or the culture. We can all identify what happiness is, and perhaps we may have experienced it at some point. All these other basic emotions are believed to be not only found among humans, but also among other primates. Now, the earliest emotional life is believed to influence what type of emotions we may feel and engage in and experience more so later in life. We find that in early life, in our earlier stages, infancy and toddlerhood, we tend to be more attracted toward pleasant stimuli. And by that we mean the high-pitched voices, and we talked about big heads, which is one of the reasons, as we stated in previous slides, that cartoon characters often have oversized heads. Then we often also withdraw from a pleasant stimuli, and the stimuli would vary depending on the child. Now, what a child may find pleasant or unpleasant is often based on what their caregivers expose them to. And we find that this may be kind of similar to when we eat different foods. If you were raised in a place where ginger was consumed on a regular basis, then you would be more likely to find ginger a pleasant stimuli. If you were not exposed to ginger, then it's possible that you would not find ginger that way. In addition to that, we also find that there are genetic predispositions for your taste preferences. For example, cilantro, which is a leaf that is common consumed in different foods. For one, I know that if you go to a taco place, they may often have that, and some people love it, like myself. And then there are other people that find it that tastes like a soap, and they don't like the taste of it. And it was recently discovered that there is a genetic predisposition for those who do not like that. So emotions are believed to also be rooted in our biological elements. And we also find that all these emotions, despite where they may come from, they're often well organized and specific by mid-infancy. Again, this could be influential in the parenting style that we would provide for the children. Some of the things in here you'll be able to read on your own, but I do want to point out that happiness is basically an emotion that is considered to be a primitive emotion, meaning we are born with it. You may have heard expressions that say that it takes a lot more effort and many more muscles to frown our face than to smile. And the argument is possibly taken from the fact that when developmental psychologists have studied children, they have deducted that happiness can be seen through smiles. And we see that as we start getting older, we are capable of smiling to specific stimuli, whereas before we may just smile while we are sleeping. And there are social smiles that begin to be apparent, and then there's laughter, and then there's different types of smile and laughter, and mostly to familiar people and specific stimuli by mid-infancy. By 10 to 12 months, we have several smiles, and under various contexts, then we see that the cognition of the child would have been polished. Unlike happiness, anger is something that is not seen until about 4 months into toddlerhood. This is basically going to increase in frequency and intensity, and typically when they are made do something that they don't want to do. So if the child does not like to take a nap, then anger may be demonstrated when they're put down for a nap. This is believed to be possible thanks to the ongoing development of the cerebral cortex, the new brain, and our ability to move our bodies differently. So the voluntary or intentional behavior basically is what may lead to some level of frustration when that is not allowed. Sadness is less common than anger, and this is typically seen in children who are deprived of familiar or their loving caregivers. So we find that children who often demonstrate sadness or in fact, in older kids, depression, it really takes a lot for the child to feel that sense of sadness. For the most part, it kind of seems that we are pre-wired to be happy. And in order for them to feel sad, the caregivers must really do something. Something drastic must happen to these children. So when we often look at social workers who interact with children, we have to wonder why the child may be sad if that's in fact noticed by the doctor or social worker. And the culprits are often the caregivers or the parents, as we know that a child typically on their own would not experience sadness. Although fear is a basic emotion, we also find that it is not present at birth. They may get startled with loud noises, but it's not a complex response initially. It's more of a component that may be a reflex. The older we get and the more exposed we get to different stimuli, we begin to have this more complex emotion of fear that is not just limited to a reflex and a jumping component, but now we begin to fear, we begin to think, we begin to anticipate, and that is a lot more complex than just a startle reflex. We find that the stranger anxiety is the most common cause, but this is not seen by or seen in every child. This is influenced a lot by the temperament of the child, the experiences the child may have had with unfamiliar adults, and also their current conditions. So if parents trust the child and they encourage them to be autonomous and to be trusting of the world, then they may be less likely to fear strangers. If the parents instead make them feel empowered and trusting, then the child would possibly experience less fear than otherwise. We also find that fear would decline with development and maturity of our cognition. The older we get, the more we comprehend that the things that used to scare us before are no longer a threat. So if you have a child who is afraid of the dark, then turning up the lights would be fine. As we get older, we tend to outgrow that fear, and that again has a lot to do with cognitive maturity. Self-regulation of our emotions is a lifelong process. In fact, the reason why therapy is so popular in our society and oftentimes worldwide, maybe not through psychologists but through other counselors, is because oftentimes we struggle to regulate those emotions that we are born with and that are presented so early in our lives. We often find that in order for us to really regulate these emotions that we will inevitably experience, we often have to take a voluntary and effortful approach to regulating and understanding our emotions. This is typically mastered and facilitated with the development of the prefrontal cortex. This is also made possible through guidance of a caregiver, of a counselor, of a role model. Oftentimes, if we were to let, for example, a teenager just have their way and they get counseling from another teenager that's just as emotional, then their emotions, rather than being controlled, they may be rampant and control them. But if this teenager were to talk to an older person or someone who is of their age but maybe a little better at regulating their emotions, we would find that they would be able to control those emotional fluctuations that are there. In early stages of our lives, we find that this is quite limited because we find that children who don't get their way, they're often overwhelmed easily. And this is typically when the feelings get too intense. Since they may not be able to communicate, that may also add to the frustration. So there's often crying that is very particular type of crying when someone is unable to regulate their emotions. Our cognitive maturity helps us soothe ourselves, and one of the ways that we can get individuals to control those emotions that may be unpleasant is by changing their thoughts, changing their mind to something else. Oftentimes when I was in therapy and people would come in with problems, for example, of infidelity or painful circumstances in life, we would focus on giving them tasks to stay busy and staying focused on other things. Because an idle mind, when you're going through difficulty, is the worst thing that could happen to you. The thoughts tend to go back to that, and individuals often are a victim of their own thoughts. So our ability to shift attention allows us to self-soothe and control our emotions. This is something that is seen as early as 4 to 6 months in children. Again, it takes a lot of practice and it takes an effortful approach, but we see it earlier on with these individuals. Mobility, which is a physical skill, is also something that allows us to regulate the emotion. If a child is distraught because he was not paid attention to by one parent, they could, with mobility, crawl over to the other parent or crawl over to somebody else and get the attention that they desired. And this movement would allow them to be able to regulate their emotions, as they may be able to find that soothing or that comfort elsewhere. Additionally, the ability to communicate through language would also help us regulate or control our emotions. We find that when children are unable to communicate effectively, or when they cannot understand or they cannot be understood, they often feel a higher level of frustration. So knowing how to express themselves and being understood by others really helps. And last, we find that this tends to improve in early and middle childhood, oftentimes at a time where vocabulary development is beginning to occur. So the words that they may be able to understand and use adequately would help parents or caregivers be able to provide the right assistance. So if a child says he is sad, mad, happy, loved, scared, or any other emotional word that they could use, this would then empower the caregiver to be able to provide the assistance that is needed. The temperament, which is an early appearing and individual differences that are seen in reactivity and self-regulation, is different in every child. It's been said that we are born with a temperament that we inherit from our parents. And the way we assess temperament is by the reactivity and the self-regulation the child has. Reactivity is basically the quickness and intensity of an emotional arousal a child has. If they are kind of slow to build up to it, then they have a different reactivity, which is part of the temperament, to that particular emotion. If they have a quick response, then that again gives them a different temperament. Also, their attention and motor activity, which allows them to regulate their emotion, is assessed during different tests that have been developed to measure a child's temperament. And self-regulation, which is, again, strategies to modify the reactivity. So anything that they could do to control that is also seen through that. And typically, this component, temperament as well as resilience, is one of the characteristics that is often used to determine whether a child is likable or not. If a child has a pleasant temperament, an easygoing temperament, easy to warm temperament, as well as being resilient, that often spells a pleasant child, a person that we'd like to have around. Someone who's not easy to warm, someone who is whiny and that doesn't necessarily let go of things, and they're not resilient at all. They tend to have a different temperament, and this can influence the parenting style. As mentioned on the genetic component, the temperament and the development of an individual depends strongly on genetic influences. The most common studies and most reliable studies to understand the genetic influences are done with identical, or also known as monozygotic twins. And that is because of the very strong similarities in genetic makeup in their genome. And what we find is that with identical twin studies, there are often similar across a wide range of temperamental traits, and that is, again, their ability to control their emotions, their activity level, their attention span, and they're also similar across personality measures, looking at whether they're introverts or extroverts, meaning outgoing or not so much, how agreeable they are to different things, and these are all done through personality tests. But we cannot, of course, negate the influence of environment. We have actually found that the environment in different cultures and different societies can influence individuals despite their genetic influences. And this is seen, for example, when comparing some Asian babies to Caucasian American babies. We have found, it's been noted that, for example, Chinese and Japanese babies tend to be less active, irritable, and vocal than Caucasian American babies. And the argument is that this is due to the individualistic and collectivist cultural differences that are seen in these two, between these three different nationalities among babies. It's interesting to note, however, that these changes are seen, or these differences are seen at such early age. You're talking about infants and toddlers that may already be demonstrating some environmental or cultural influences. We also see that boys tend to be more active and daring than girls, and this, again, believed to be due mostly because of genetic, as it is seen worldwide, regardless of whether you're Chinese, Japanese, or American. We actually have this here. And as a result of that, interestingly, and maybe not so much surprising, boys often get more injured than girls do. Attachment is one of the most important forms of social development that has been assessed during infancy. And there have been different ways and different methods that researchers have tried to understand attachment styles. And what attachment is basically a strong affectionate tie that we have for people that are special in our lives, people that we spend a good amount of time with, and typically that attachment would be due to pleasure and pleasant experiences and joy. However, sadly, we've also seen that there's attachment due to unpleasant experiences, and that's when individuals become dependent of different things. We're going to look at Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, which was done among a group of infants and their mothers and caregivers, and I'll describe that in the next slide. Mary Ainsworth basically was in a laboratory setting, and this became known as the strange situation because mothers and their one-year-old infants were asked to be part of a laboratory experiment in which there was a one-sided window through which the researchers would observe the mothers that were volunteering with their babies. The room where the mothers and the babies would be at had toys scattered throughout the lab, and mothers would receive an earpiece through which they would hear instructions from the researchers. The instructions were basically to put the child down and let the child wonder, and meanwhile the researchers were taking notes to see how the child was reacting or responding to these cues. At some point, mom would be asked through the earpiece to step out, and they would also assess the child's reaction. And then at some point there would also be a stranger that would walk in, and if the child was crying, then the stranger would be asked to try to soothe the child, and they would also assess to see how the child reacted to a stranger. All in all, throughout the study, they found that there were 4 different types of attachment that were noticed among kids. And the first one, and the best type of attachment that was noticed, was securely attached, or a secure attachment. This is basically composed of a child who would be okay with mom putting him down so he could explore. The child would wander around and grab a ball, grab toys, but every now and then come back home using mother as a base. When mother would leave, the child would be distressed and sad, but as soon as mother would come back, the child would easily get happy and be soothed by mother's care. An avoidant child, however, was different. The avoidant child would not cry when mom would leave. In fact, sometimes they were okay with her leaving, or they would not express anything. And when mother would return, they would often just avoid her as if she was not important. Surprisingly, they did other studies on this, and they found that these children often were cared for by somebody else and not necessarily their parents. Resistant children, or the resistant attachment style, were those who were anxious when they were separated from their mother, but unlike the securely attached who was easily soothed once mother came back, the resistant children would be upset when mother would come back. So sometimes they would hit mom, or they would tightly hold on to their clothes, demonstrating a sense of anger that mom had left them. And the 4th attachment style is basically the disorganized and disoriented, which show inconsistent and often contradictory behavior. So sometimes when mom would leave, they would be happier and more comfortable, and when mom would come back, they would sometimes feel scared and sometimes even cry. And what was noted after is that some of these kids were actually sometimes spanked, or parents were quite strict with their disciplinary action, and that's why the child would respond that way. It used to be believed that children were capable of only attaching to one parent. We now know that children are capable of attaching to multiple people, and we find that with the growing number of fathers who are stay-at-home fathers and mothers work, this because of changes in our economy and also because of choices, we find that children are beginning to attach to their fathers, but despite the fact that they're capable of attaching to multiple parents, we find that the attachment is not the same. The attachment to a mother is often based on their responses and the behaviors and their interaction with the mother, which tends to be more traditional games and more verbal attention and more hugs and more soothing. And children react well to that. Whereas with the father, who tends to engage in more physical and rough sort of activity, the attachment of the father would be different. A child would probably feel a little bit more inclined to spending time with dad when looking for a thrill. So if a dad is the type of dad to pick up the child and spin him around and maybe even toss him up in the air as it's sometimes seen, then the child would have an attachment and know to go to dad whenever they feel like having that. But oftentimes when they feel sick and they need someone to care for them and soothe them, they often look for mom to get that chicken soup or to hug them and hold them. And so we find that both types of attachment are demonstrated and capable simultaneously, but they are seen based on the interaction with the child. One of the interesting things in here is that we find that paternal warmth often predicts a long-term favorable cognitive, emotional, and social development. And this has been an interesting statement that's been made and replicated and supported by different studies. And one of the things they find is that a child is in need of having that type of support and that type of stimulation from either their father or from someone that would be maybe like an adopted father or a role model, which could be an uncle and father-like figure. And we find that having that stimulation and having that attachment of different entities, but nonetheless an attachment, is necessary for a good personality and a healthy attachment. As we get older, we begin to pay a lot more attention to our peers and less to our parents. Of course, during infancy and toddlerhood, not much can be done, but as we get into adolescence, you'd be able to see that shift happen a little bit more drastically. The interaction that infants and toddlers could have with their peers can also help them so that they could begin to prepare themselves for school-age activities. We find that children who have healthy interactions with and relationships with their peers often have better interactions with their friends once they start school, and rather than hitting or throwing tantrums, they may learn about physical and emotional self-control, as they may be forced to share crayons and learn that it's not all about them, and also learn to be polite rather than throwing a tantrum. So attachment to their peers and their interactions are also healthy. According to Freud, we're all born with an id component, with a desire to just satisfy ourselves and please ourselves. Well, we find that as we get older, it is noted that around 12 to 18 months, the capacities to comply with whatever expectations and wishes are from our caregivers begins to be noted with more frequency. The active resistance in toddlerhood, which is what's known as the terrible twos, is not necessarily a prediction of later personalities or some defiance that could be seen throughout adulthood. This is sometimes a component that some people have argued is due to the ongoing physical changes, which may make us a little bit more irritable, and also the discovery that we have matured with our and developed a cerebral cortex as well as autonomy based on our ability to move. And so when children discover this in here, then of course it makes their compliance a little bit more difficult, as they just figure it out that they know how to walk and that they could get to places on their own. So it's very tempting to be able to comply. This often works best when children get an advance notice about what will be expected of them, and also with repeated prompts and reminders. Oftentimes, I've heard parents who say, well, I told him once, and I told him I would not repeat myself, and he didn't obey. Well, if you're dealing with a toddler, if you're dealing with an infant, you'd find that you'd get the best results if you engage in constant reminders. Being told once is not enough for a child to comply. As we get older, we begin to value patience and their ability to wait, and something that we call delay of gratification, which is our ability to wait for an appropriate time to engage in a tempting act. For example, a child who is told, I'm going to put a cookie in front of you, and if you do not eat the cookie, by the time I get back, I'll give you two. What we find is that children who are young, they often are not able to hold on. They often feel tempted to eat the cookie, and we see that as they get older, they are able to delay that gratification. As you are perhaps in college, or if you are an adult, you may remember when being a young person, delaying things. Oftentimes you want to get that new car, but you are told, look, just delay it. You'll get it when you graduate. And part of your cognitive maturity and your ability to withstand that temptation is a level of maturation, a sign of maturation. If you are able to delay that for when you graduate, then you are demonstrating a different type of maturity than your peers. We often find that there are gender differences with delay of gratification. Girls tend to be more self-controlled than boys. Boys tend to want more instantly, and they don't think much about the consequences, whereas girls tend to be a lot more reserved and conservative. This can be seen in interactions with their friends, and sometimes even in the sexual interaction among them. It's been said that if girls were as outgoing and as outspoken as boys would be when it came down to sex, our population would be much, much larger. But it is typically girls who balance that out because although there may be a desire to engage in that behavior, they are able to control themselves better than boys. And overall, this ability to delay our gratification has been said to be influenced by the temperament and the quality of our caregivers.